Every balance sheet tells a story it was designed to tell. In November 2022, the story FTX told the world was this. A 29-year-old had built the safest place in crypto to keep your money. Regulators trusted him. Senators took his calls. The biggest venture capital firms on earth, Sequoia, SoftBank, Tiger Global wired him billions and called it a privilege. Then, in 10 days, it was gone. Not slowly, not the way empires usually fall, with warning signs stacking up for years until even the optimists give in. This one went from safest exchange in crypto to criminal enterprise faster than most people could refresh their portfolio app. And here's the part that should actually bother you. It wasn't hackers. It wasn't a market crash nobody saw coming. It wasn't even, really, a secret. The hole in FTX's balance sheet was sitting there, in the numbers, the whole time. People just weren't looking. Or they were looking and decided not to see it, because the story was too good, and the man telling it looked too much like someone who couldn't possibly be lying. That's what this episode is really about. Not just what Sam Bankman-Fried did, but how an entire industry, smart people, credentialed people, people whose job is literally to catch this, agreed together not to ask the one question that would have ended it all 2 years earlier. Stick around, because by the end of this, you're going to understand exactly how $8 billion can disappear in plain sight, and why the people closest to the money are so often the last ones to see it burning. To understand how this happened, you have to understand what Sam Bankman-Fried looked like from the outside, because the disguise is the whole story. He didn't look like a con man. Con men are supposed to be smooth. He was the opposite. Rumpled t-shirt, cargo shorts, hair that looked like he'd lost a fight with it that morning. He slept on a beanbag in the office. He drove a Corolla, or claimed to, while running a company that would soon be valued at $32 billion. Every detail of his presentation screamed the same message. This is not someone who cares about money for its own sake. This is someone who cares about ideas. And the idea he sold was almost impossible to argue with. He called it effective altruism, the notion that the most ethical thing a brilliant person could do wasn't to become a doctor or a teacher. It was to make as much money as legally possible, as fast as possible, and give nearly all of it away to fix the world's biggest problems. Malaria nets, pandemic prevention, the kind of causes that make skepticism feel a little bit like cruelty. He'd studied physics at MIT. He'd worked at Jane Street, one of the most quantitatively rigorous trading firms on the planet. By the time he founded Alameda Research in 2017 and then FTX in 2019, he had built a resume that read like a permission slip. People didn't just trust him with their money. They trusted him with the story that crypto, an industry drowning in scams and rug pulls, finally had its adult in the room. Here's what nobody wanted to say out loud. The entire pitch depended on believing that a person's appearance of selflessness was proof of their honesty, that the messier someone looked, the less likely they were lying to you. It's a bias almost everyone has, and almost nobody names. And it is exactly the kind of blind spot a sophisticated operator can walk straight through. By 2021, FTX was processing billions in daily trading volume. Celebrities lined up. Tom Brady, Steph Curry, Larry David filmed a Super Bowl ad calling FTX the future of finance and calling doubters the same fools who once doubted the wheel. The Miami Heat renamed their arena after the company. This wasn't a shady offshore exchange anymore. This was mainstream. This was, by every outward signal, safe. And that word safe is doing an enormous amount of work in this story. Because underneath the beanbag and the Corolla and the malaria nets, there was a second company nobody outside a small circle fully understood. It was called Alameda Research. and it was quietly holding the keys to everything. Here's the setup you need. And it's simpler than it sounds once you strip the crypto jargon out of it. FTX was the exchange, the place where ordinary customers deposited real money and crypto, trusting it would sit there safely, the way you'd trust a bank vault or a brokerage account. Alameda Research was a separate trading firm, also founded by Bankman-Fried, that made bets in the crypto markets using its own capital. On paper, these were two different companies with two different purposes. In reality, according to prosecutors and FTX's own bankruptcy filings, Alameda had something no other trading firm on the exchange had: a secret back door. Internal code inside FTX allowed Alameda's account to spend far more money than it actually held, effectively an unlimited line of credit, funded by customer deposits sitting in FTX's vaults. Think about what that actually means. When you deposited money into FTX, you weren't just trusting an exchange. You were, without knowing it, standing next to an open vault door that Alameda could walk through any time it needed cash to cover a bad trade, to make an investment, to plug a hole somewhere else. The two companies that were supposed to be separate were, financially, the same organism, with FTX customer deposits acting as Alameda's private piggy bank. This is the part every viewer needs to sit with, because it's the mechanism, not just the headline. Exchanges are supposed to function like a coat check. You hand over your coat, your money, and the coat check's only job is to hold it until you want it back. FTX had quietly turned itself into something else. A coat check that was lending your coat out to a friend, betting he wouldn't need it back before you did. For most of 2021 and into 2022, that bet paid off, because crypto prices kept rising and few people asked for their coats back all at once. The gap between what FTX owed customers and what it actually held could stay hidden as long as confidence stayed high and withdrawals stayed low. Confidence, though, is the most fragile currency in finance. And in November 2022, something happened that made everyone want their coat back at exactly the same time. On November 2nd, 2022, a crypto news outlet called CoinDesk published a leaked internal balance sheet from Alameda Research. It wasn't a hacked document or a whistleblower with a smoking gun photo. It was, in a strange way, worse than that it was Alameda's own accounting, sitting quietly in the open, telling on itself. The balance sheet showed that a massive chunk of Alameda's assets, billions of dollars worth, wasn't cash, or Bitcoin, or anything with an independent market price. It was a token called FTT. And FTT wasn't some outside asset Alameda happened to own. FTT was FTX's own house token, created by FTX itself, and largely controlled by FTX and Alameda. If that sounds circular, that's because it was. Imagine a company that prints its own coupons, declares those coupons are worth $100 each, and then uses a giant pile of those self-printed coupons as collateral to borrow real money. That's roughly what the CoinDesk report revealed. Alameda's financial foundation wasn't built on solid ground. It was built on an asset that FTX itself had invented and could inflate or deflate the value of, almost at will, once professional traders understood what they were looking at. The reaction was immediate and brutal. Changpeng Zhao, known as CZ, the CEO of Binance, FTX's biggest rival and an early investor in the company, announced on social media that Binance would be selling off its entire stake of FTT tokens, citing what he called recent revelations. That single tweet functioned like a match dropped in a room that had been quietly filling with gas for years. Because here's what a token price crash actually does to a structure like Alameda's. If FTT is your collateral, and the market price of FTT starts collapsing because everyone's suddenly trying to sell it at once, your collateral shrinks in real time. Loans that looked fully backed an hour ago suddenly look underwater. Alameda needed cash to cover the gap, and the only place that cash could realistically come from, given the backdoor built into FTX's code, was customer deposits. Word spread within hours, the way it only can in an industry that never sleeps. Customers who had trusted FTX with their savings retirement money, life savings, money set aside for a house down payment, logged into the app and did the only rational thing left to do. They tried to withdraw everything, all at once. It's called a bank run, and exchanges, like banks, are built on a promise that only works if everyone doesn't cash it in on the same day. What happened between November 6th and November 11th, 2022, is one of the fastest institutional collapses in modern financial history, and the timeline alone tells you almost everything about how fragile the whole structure had been. On November 6th, customers began pulling funds in volume. FTX's team, publicly, insisted everything was fine. Bankman-Fried tweeted, in words that would later be read back to him in a courtroom, that FTX was fine, that assets were fine, and that there was no run on customer funds, even as, internally, the company was scrambling to locate money that should have been sitting untouched in customer accounts and simply wasn't there. By November 8th, the math had become undeniable. FTX halted withdrawals altogether. For customers, this is the moment the coat check stops answering the phone. Whatever reassurances had come before, the inability to get your own money out is the one signal that cuts through every narrative. Bankman-Fried, in a stunning reversal, announced that FTX had reached an agreement for Binance to acquire the company and cover the shortfall, a lifeline extended by the very rival whose tweet had triggered the collapse. That lifeline lasted about a day. On November 9th, after Binance's team got a real look inside FTX's books, the tangled intercompany loans, the missing customer funds, the scale of the whole, Binance walked away. Their public statement was almost clinical in its bluntness. The issues were beyond their ability or willingness to help. Without a buyer, without customer funds, and without a story that held together anymore, there was only one place left to go. On November 11th, 2022, FTX, Alameda Research, and more than 100 affiliated companies filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in Delaware. Bankman-Fried resigned as CEO that same day. The person brought in to lead the company through bankruptcy was John Ray III, a restructuring specialist who had previously overseen the unwinding of Enron, one of the most notorious accounting frauds in American corporate history. His sworn statement to the bankruptcy court, made under penalty of perjury, became one of the most quoted lines of the entire scandal. In over 40 years of legal and restructuring work, he said, he had never seen such a complete failure of corporate controls and such a complete absence of trustworthy financial information at any company, anywhere, coming from the man who cleaned up Enron. That sentence wasn't hyperbole. It was a professional diagnosis. Roughly $8 billion in customer funds were unaccounted for. Money that people believed was sitting safely in their accounts, the digital equivalent of a bank vault, had, in reality, been used to cover Alameda's trading losses, fund political donations, back venture investments, and, in some cases, prosecutors would later argue, simply spent. This is the part that tends to make people the angriest once they understand it, because it's not abstract anymore. It's not a chart. It's specific. According to trial testimony and court filings, customer deposits helped fund a lifestyle and an influence campaign that looked nothing like a company operating on the edge of insolvency. There was a $250 million Bahamas real estate portfolio, penthouses purchased in the names of top executives. There were more than $100 million in political donations, spread across both major American political parties, an unusual bipartisan generosity that bought Bankman-Fried access and credibility in Washington, the same access that had regulators treating him less like a risk and more like a partner in shaping crypto policy. There were venture investments made with what prosecutors described as reckless disregard for whether the underlying capital actually belonged to FTX or to its customers. Loans to executives, in some cases in the tens of millions of dollars, with little documentation of how or whether they'd be repaid. None of this was hidden in some encrypted vault requiring master hackers to expose. Prosecutors would later present evidence that Alameda's own internal spreadsheets tracked a fiat at FTX account, a running tally of exactly how much of FTX's customer money had been funneled into Alameda's operations. At its peak, that number reportedly exceeded $8 billion. It wasn't a secret from the people inside the building. It was a secret from everyone outside it. At trial, 3 of Bankman-Fried's closest colleagues, including Caroline Ellison, the CEO of Alameda Research, and one of his former romantic partners, testified against him under cooperation agreements with prosecutors. Their testimony described a culture where the line between the company's money and the customer's money simply stopped mattering to leadership, even as it mattered enormously, legally and morally, to the customers. In November 2023, a jury found Sam Bankman-Fried guilty on all 7 counts, including wire fraud and conspiracy to commit money laundering. In March 2024, he was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Sit with the shape of that sentence for a second. 25 years is roughly what you'd get for some categories of armed robbery. The difference is, nobody pointed a gun at anyone. He didn't need to. All he needed was a story people wanted to believe, and a structure complicated enough that almost nobody checked whether the story was actually true. Here's where most explainer channels wrap up with a tidy moral about greed and move on. That's not good enough, because greed doesn't explain why sophisticated investors, firms managing billions of dollars, with teams of analysts whose entire job is diligence, handed Bankman-Fried money without demanding the most basic financial disclosures a small business loan officer would require. Sequoia Capital, one of the most respected venture firms in the world, later admitted publicly that its own due diligence process on FTX had been thin. Some reporting described investment committee meetings where Bankman-Fried played a video game during the pitch, and the disengagement read, "To the people in the room," not as a red flag, but as proof of genius, someone so brilliant, so unbothered by convention, that normal scrutiny felt almost insulting to apply. That's the actual lesson, and it's uncomfortable precisely because it isn't about crypto at all. It's about how easily a compelling identity can substitute for a compelling audit. The beanbag chair, the Corolla, the malaria nets. Every detail of the presentation was, whether by design or by accident, doing the emotional work that a balance sheet was supposed to do. And when the identity is convincing enough, people stop asking the boring, unglamorous question that would have caught this in year 1. Show me exactly where the money is, right now, and prove it. FTX collapsed not because crypto is inherently fraudulent, and not simply because one person was willing to lie. It collapsed because an entire ecosystem, investors, regulators, media, customers collectively decided that the story was good enough to skip the verification. The fraud wasn't hidden in complexity. The complexity was the hiding place, and everyone was invited to look away from it together. In the aftermath, U.S. regulators and lawmakers pushed for tighter custody rules for crypto exchanges, clearer separation requirements between trading arms and customer-facing platforms, and stronger proof-of-reserve standards industry-wide. Whether those changes go far enough is still being argued in hearing rooms right now, but the direction is the same one this channel keeps finding. Case after case. Collapse after collapse. Every collapse leaves a regulation behind. If there's one thing worth carrying out of this story, it's this. The most dangerous financial structures rarely announce themselves as dangerous. They arrive well-dressed, or deliberately underdressed, backed by famous names, wrapped in a mission that makes questioning it feel small. The people who lost money in FTX weren't foolish. They were reasonably trusting an institution that had been vouched for by nearly everyone whose job it was to vouch responsibly. Which leaves you with the only question that actually protects you going forward. Not does this person seem trustworthy, but can I verify, independently, exactly where my money is, right now? If the answer takes more than a beanbag chair and a good story to get to, that's the signal. That's always been the signal.